So it's 4 o'clock on a Thursday, so it's time for me to welcome you back to the Food for Sustainability and Grow weekly webinar. Today we start a brand new series. We will talk about carbon markets. Naturally, we will be focusing in agriculture. And today's session will focus particularly on the concept of carbon sequestration and how carbon farming contributes to climate change and climate mitigation, examining its significance, challenges, and its practical implications for agriculture practices. And of course, you will not want to miss to learn how the new European carbon removal certification scheme is being translated into the Portuguese law. So I hope you stay tuned and enjoy the topic. So carbon sequestration, it's the process by which carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere and stored in soils, plants, oceans, and plays a critical role in offsetting gas emissions. In the context of agriculture, practice such as agroforestry, no-till farming, cover cropping, and rotational grazing, as we all know, can enhance carbon sequestration, turning agricultural landscapes into effective carbon sinks. But several challenges emerge, and we'll be hearing about them. The questions of quantification of the amount of carbon being sequestered, the question of additionality, the permanence, the leakage effects, transparency, and the trade-offs all need to be taken into account for an effective carbon market to materialize. And we'll be addressing these topics with our esteemed experts who will shed light on several aspects of carbon sequestration and its implications. So we have the pleasure to be joined by Alan Matthews. Alan is a professor emeritus of European Agriculture Policy at Trinity College in Dublin, bringing decades of experience in agriculture policy analysis. Alan insights into the European perspective on carbon sequestration and policy measures need to incentivize sustainable practices will provide for sure very valuable perspectives. We also have the pleasure to be joined by Assunção Cristas, who is a partner at VDA, Viera de Almeida lawyers, and Assunção is also a professor at Nova School of Law, offering a unique blend of legal expertise and practical knowledge. Assunção's works in aligning Portuguese law with carbon credits frameworks will for sure provide insights into the legal frameworks needed to support carbon sequestration initiatives in agriculture. And our third speaker, Bautze from the Soil Science Department at FiBL in Switzerland, brings a wealth of expertise in soil management and carbon sequestration practices. A research focused on innovation soil management techniques that maximize carbon storage potential, offering actionable insights for farmers and policymakers alike. So altogether, we'll explore the challenges and of course also the opportunities surrounding carbon sequestration in agriculture. We'll be highlighting practical strategies for enhancing soil health, biodiversity, and of course resilience. But at the same time, we will try to mitigate climate change. Get ready to engage in this lively discussion and of course harnessing agriculture's potential to combat climate change effectively. And before we proceed, let me just remind you that our webinars are recorded, so please just keep your cameras off if you do not wish to be recorded. Questions are welcome. As you know, we will address your questions after each speaker presentation. For this, you can use the chat here on Teams, or as we prefer, you can use Slido because we can all see your question. Is easiest. Also for the speaker in terms of management, but your questions are of course more than welcome. And as always, Rita has prepared a short, small warm-up in Slido, both to get us familiar with Slido and also to get introduced to the topic. So what you need to do you can either scan this QR code, or you can just type www.slide.com in your browser, and then in the hashtag box, you need to insert the code F for S Academy, and you should be in, and you should be ready for Slido. So we have 3 questions. Each of the questions will point to one of our speakers, so I hope you enjoy them. Rita, can we have the questions? Okay, we don't have many people in Slido, but please do join our Slido. And our first questions relates to your knowledge about the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that European agriculture represents of the total European emissions. And this is the figure for 2019. Do you know roughly how much this agriculture represents? And just to give you kind of the bulk numbers, which are more difficult to relate, but in 2019, the EU 27 countries, agriculture production was directly responsible for the emissions amounting to 386 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And these were the emissions that were reported under the Sector 3 agriculture. Of course, this does not account with emissions that are reported under Sector 4, which relate to land use change and forestry, and relate mainly to the management of agricultural land, so drainage and agriculture, use of organic soils, that also, as we all know, cause substantial carbon dioxide emissions. So I think we have here a winner. So your idea is that agriculture is responsible for 38%. In fact, agriculture is not that responsible. Not everything can be accounted for agriculture, but the true number is that in Europe, 11% of the greenhouse gases emissions are attributed to the agriculture sector, mainly from nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizers, and methane from ruminants. So there's still some scope, but we cannot blame everything in agriculture. 11% is the current level of emissions from agriculture. Hopefully, after this webinar, we can bring this figure down. We'll aim for that. Thank you. And this is something that Alan, I'm sure, will share some more lights on it. And now we have a second question that Assunção Cristas has been working, has been very involved with, which is the Portuguese Climate Framework Law. So do you know what goal does Portugal aim to achieve by 2045 as outlined in the Portuguese Climate Framework Law? Is this goal trying to achieve carbon neutrality, carbon-free cities? Are they trying to expand organic agriculture production, or to improve urban mobility and reduce urban pollution? I think all of these goals are very important. But what is the main goal? I can tell you that the Portuguese Climate Framework Law established a target of at least 13 megatons on average of net CO2 equivalent sink of the land use and forestry for the sector between the years of 2045 and 2050. And indeed, you're absolutely right. This framework tries to achieve carbon neutrality, and this achievement will, of course, mean that we need to be faster in terms of decarbonization of electricity generation, urban mobility, and also increase the country's carbon potential, sequestral potential. So to achieve the carbon neutrality, that's not only related to agriculture management, but there are a lot of other initiatives that need to be in place. I'm sure Assunção Cristas will be pleased to shed some more light on these topics. Thank you so much. Well done, audience. There was not a lot of divergence here. And then Lynn has been working about carbon in cropland soils. So a question becomes, do you have an idea how many tons of carbon in cropland soils are lost per year in the EU? So we have here 4 different values: 800,000 tons, 1 million tons, 6.5 million tons, 7.4 million tons. It's always difficult to relate the figures in abstract, in absolute value. We can tell that some of these figures are quite high. But cropland soils in the EU are estimated to lose about 7.4 million tons of carbon per year, according to a European Commission report from 2021. And one of the main sources of carbon losses in many countries are former peatland soils that are artificially drained for agriculture production. But I'm sure, Lynn, that this is only not the only cause for losing carbon in the soils, and we will hear later more about this. So thank you everyone for taking part. So now that we have done the warm-up, I will call Alan Matthews to the floor. And while Alan prepares his presentation, I will just briefly introduce Alan. So Alan is a professor emeritus of European Agriculture Policy at the University of Dublin Trinity College, Ireland, and is also a former president of the European Association of Agriculture Economists. His recent research focused on EU agriculture policy, originally with an interest in agriculture trade policy and agricultural trade and development issues. More recently, he has been a member of the Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council and has taken a special interest in the potential role of market-based instruments to accelerate emissions mitigation in the agriculture and land use sectors. He is a regular contributor to the blog capreform.eu on issues relating to EU's common agriculture policy. Alan, I see that your presentation is already up. Thank you so much, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Claudia, and good afternoon to all participants. It's a great pleasure to open what I think is going to be a really interesting webinar on this topic of carbon farming and carbon sequestration. And I'm going to begin by just reminding you of the challenge that we face in the European Union. Of course, everyone knows that our primary objective is to reduce emissions. But we also know that in any of the scenarios or pathways to 2050, there are always going to be the so-called hard-to-abate emissions, largely indeed from the agricultural sector as we come closer to 2050. And we need to find ways to offset these hard-to-abate emissions. So you can see in the most recent European Commission scenario, the green bar there underneath the x-axis illustrates emissions, the sequestration, if you like, in land-based or nature-based alternatives. And the very small red bar represents offsets coming from industrial emissions. And we know that this technology is still very much in its infancy, but will need to be scaled up if we are to meet our overall net zero objective. So having indicated the importance of these land-based sequestration, when we actually look at what is happening to our LULUCF sector. This is what Claudia has called this sector 4 in the inventory accounts. And we see the picture is not a very happy one. So the black line indicates the net sink, if you like, that is represented by the LULUCF sector. And you can see that in recent years, it has been sharply diminishing, mainly because of a reduced sink in European forests. And this is partly to do with the age structure of these forests, partly to do with increased offtake, not least for sort of biomass energy use. And of course, also because of climate change and the damage that that is causing. And you'll be very aware of that in Portugal with wildfires and so on. We do have in the LULUCF regulation a target to increase that sink from about 220 million tons CO2 equivalent at the moment to 310 tons. So we do have quite a challenge to achieve that regulatory target. And part of the answer that the Commission at least sees is to put emphasis on this idea of carbon farming. So the Commission sees a number of benefits. Of course, it should increase carbon removals, contribute to that overall LULUCF target in 2030. But it could also potentially result in additional income for land managers. It could also have co-benefits in terms of greater biodiversity and improved nature conservation, and it could contribute to increased climate resilience, both on farm and forest land. Now, many of these instruments, if you like, to promote carbon farming, and Claudia has indicated what is covered under this heading. So it's things like afforestation, agroforestry, improved forest management, but it can also be reducing emissions from organic soils through rewetting, or it can be increased soil carbon sequestration in mineral soils. And then there's also blue carbon, which is the marine side of it, but we're concentrating here on agriculture. Now, many of the initiatives which can promote carbon farming through these various channels can already be supported under the Common Agricultural Policy, either through eco schemes or through the voluntary agri-environment and climate measures. But we know that the CAP budget is limited, and we also know there are many demands on this budget. So I think an important motivation for the carbon farming initiative, as proposed by the Commission, is the idea that it could attract private finance to actually help to finance some of the initiatives that farmers could take. But in order to do that, we need to have some measure of what farmers are doing. And that's where this certification framework for carbon removals, which was recently agreed by the co-legislator, comes in. So the Commission put forward a proposal in November 2022, and it had two main objectives. One was to define the criteria for carbon removal activities so that we only certify high quality removal. So what exactly is meant by quality is an important element of the certification framework. But then also to define rules for the verification and certification of carbon removal, so that if farmers were being paid to do this, that those who are buying these credits have a measure of security that they are getting what they're paying for, if you like. In other words, that there is a strong element of credibility. So the underlying purpose is indeed to bring greater credibility, transparency, and environmental integrity to the carbon market, to avoid what unfortunately has often been the case up to now of greenwashing, and also to attract more private finance. Now, you're going to hear a lot more about the certification framework from a Portuguese perspective in a moment. So let me just summarize the broad principles for those who may not have had a chance to become familiar with it as yet. So there are these certification criteria, which are called the quality criteria. And they emphasize 4 elements: quantification, additionality, long-term storage, and also should make a contribution to sustainability. Now, they're just, in a sense, general criteria. They then have to be worked out in practice through certification methodologies. And these methodologies are currently under construction in close consultation with the expert group on carbon removals. They've just had their 4th meeting, and if anyone is interested, their meetings are all web streamed and you can go in and listen to the discussions as they take place. The certification process is set out in the legislation. Operators will submit proposals to a certification scheme, and these schemes will in turn be audited by nationally approved certification bodies. Importantly, the coverage of the certification framework goes a little bit beyond what we would normally define as carbon removals under, if you like, the IPCC definitions. Because it was always foreseen that it would include emissions from soils, from organic soils, where the re-wetting, eventually could result in additional carbon storage, but the primary purpose is to reduce the emissions from the cultivation of peat soils. The European Parliament was keen to extend the idea of this certification framework also to agricultural emissions. So those emissions of nitrous oxide, methane from ruminants and manure management that Claudia has referred to. That was not agreed on this occasion, but there is a review clause where the Commission will return to take up this issue again in 2026. Importantly, it's also a voluntary framework. So there is, of course, a voluntary carbon market at the moment where you do have operators who certify removals, and they can continue. But I would guess, at least in the European Union, if they want to be credible, they will in future have to meet the criteria set out in these certification methodologies. An important debate in the approval of the legislation was around the relative role of permanent and temporary removals, because industrial removals, at least in principle, we can think of as permanent. If we can remove carbon dioxide from the air and store it underground in geological reservoirs, for example, the hope is that that will be effectively permanent. But we're well aware that carbon storage in soils or indeed in trees is much more temporary and can easily be reversed. And in the original Commission proposal, there was no differentiation made between permanent and temporary removals. Essentially, all credits would be called carbon removal units. But in the final legislation, we now actually have 4 different types of removal units, each linked to a different carbon removal practice or technology, if you like, of which carbon farming would be one. The other big debate around the legislation was how would these credits be used? Because the main concern of critics has been that you might see these temporary carbon farming removal certificates or credits, that they might be used to offset long-term emissions, permanent emissions of CO2, which we know remain in the atmosphere for very long periods of time, either in a compliance market or also when companies make climate neutral claims. And in particular, environmental NGOs long sought a prohibition on the use of credits, either in compliance or voluntary markets. The Commission response was that the use of these certificates should be determined in the relative legislation, for example, in the emissions trading scheme legislation or the LULUCF legislation, and not in the certification framework itself. And that view eventually prevailed. It's interesting that the emissions trading scheme legislation, in fact, requires the Commission to report in 2026 on how permanent removals might be accounted for in the ETS. But as I say, there's now a recognition in the legislation that carbon farming removals are not considered permanent. So we'll have to wait to see whether there is any change in that position. A final novelty in the final agreement is that any credit certificates generated, for example, from carbon farming, must contribute to union climate objectives and cannot be traded with third countries. To me, as I say, a lot of the practices that would support carbon farming and support farmers in undertaking these activities can already be supported under the Common Agricultural Policy. But we know that in practice, there's been limited interest by member states to date. And we've seen very critical reports, for example, from the European Court of Auditors, which have argued that the climate contribution of the last CAP has been very limited. We need to see a little bit more what the latest CAP strategic plans might contribute. I understand there will be a report from the EU CAP network next month, which may help to quantify that. But I suppose the question I want to pose for discussion is how interested will member states be to make use of this certification framework if they want to actually encourage and incentivize their farmers to do more in terms of carbon farming. The legislation clearly promotes results-based outcomes, the important emphasis on quantification here. And paying for certified carbon removals. And this is clearly going to be more expensive, more complicated for member states to administer than the action-based payments that they can make at the moment under either eco schemes or voluntary agri-environment climate schemes. There's also interesting trade-offs or questions to be answered. For example, if we do have under the CAP a payment to farmers, for example, to adopt cover crops, and as a result, there is evidence of increased soil carbon sequestration, would farmers then in turn be eligible to be paid for that additional carbon storage, having already, in a sense, been funded to undertake the practice? And there are also issues to do with results-based payments. If you want to pay farmers specifically in terms of the tons of carbon that they can actually sequester, would that indeed be compatible with the principles that underlie the payments for voluntary agri-environment schemes at the moment? The other angle is to ask how much interest might there be amongst private actors to actually purchase these temporary carbon farming removal certificates. And it's true that increasingly there is a requirement on some private actors, I think particularly of the aviation sector, where there is a requirement for them to actually purchase offsets for their emissions. And as we've seen in the first chart, at the moment, the only game in town is land-based or nature-based removals. I presume in the longer term, the demand for carbon farming removal credits will depend on the price at which permanent removal credits become available. If they are still extremely expensive, then there could well be an appetite for the temporary removals. But if their cost comes down, I would assume that these private actors would prefer to pay for permanent removals than for the removals generated from carbon farming. I'm also conscious that we've had a number of new directives, the Empowering Consumers Directive, the proposed Green Claims Directives, which could also influence potential demand by regulating the use that companies can make of carbon credits. To summarize then, the EU Carbon Farming Initiative was intended to help member states to reach their LULUCF targets, to provide an additional income stream for farmers, and to attract additional private finance by providing high-quality carbon credits. The technical potential for nature-based carbon storage seems clear. We're also going to hear more about that later in the webinar. but how we can effectively realize that potential is maybe less so. I would argue that all carbon farming practices can currently be supported under the cap. So will we see member states be attracted by a results-based scheme such as required under the certification framework? And I might conclude that the value added of the certification framework, at least for carbon farming, because of course it also covers other carbon removal technologies, but at least for carbon farming, might seem relatively low. And I would argue that there will be high setup costs for the relevant methodologies and potentially uncertain demand for temporary credits from the private sector. So I look forward to the discussion, and I hope that has stimulated some thoughts. Thank you very much, Claudia.
Thank you, Alan, for such an interesting presentation and such a good overview of all the intricacies that the question of carbon sequestration and carbon certification poses. So just before I go to our participants' questions, so you have posed a lot of issues that need to be dealt in terms of policy to enable these markets you mentioned the incentives, you mentioned, the willingness for farmers to take up their concerns about food production, the concerns about leakages. Where do you think the EU should start? What do you think, in your perspective, should be priority to enable this effective carbon markets?
The certification framework will, I think, give rise to high quality credits. It sets a very high bar in terms of what will be eligible for certification. I think one of the issues here is, will that just simply mean it's very expensive for farmers to enroll in potential certified schemes? Because there is going to be quite a lot of administration involved. And the other alternative is perhaps not to put so much emphasis on the idea of paying for carbon per se, but perhaps just to pay farmers, and of course this is potentially mostly public money, but maybe also private sector actors will be willing to see a contribution which also includes some of the other sustainability issues, such as biodiversity, such as soil health, as well as carbon farming. But whether this will be done, as I say, within the certification framework or simply as a sort of financial contribution seems to me still up to debate. And I'm really interested to hear what the other speakers have to say about this.
Yeah, exactly. And you have not clearly pointed in your presentation, but probably there are other policies like changing diets and changing certain habits that have a direct implication, the way farmers do farm and the way they are willing to change their crops and their crops management, that could also be factored into the policy. Alan, we have a question here from our participants, and someone is asking if you think there will be more legislation upgrades in the next years.
That's a really interesting question, because of course we do see increased, if you like, contestation of legislation around climate and environmental issues in the European Council, in the European Parliament and in the Council coming up to this important election in June. It's clear that there will be a Commission proposal to put forward a 2040 climate target. So we at the moment only have a legal target going as far as 2030. We've seen the communication from the Commission suggesting that this might be a target of around 90% reduction in net emissions by 2040. And it's quite clear that you saw it already in the first chart that I presented, that as we move closer and closer to that goal, agricultural emissions take up a larger and larger share of the residual. So we will not reach 90% reduction without addressing agricultural emissions. So from that point of view, I think I would answer yes to that question. I think there will be a need for more legislation. And I guess the question that remains unanswered until after June is what will be the political will to actually make that ambitious legislation after the election.
Yes, definitely. That's why we all should go and vote for those elections to ensure that, you know, at least our views can be can come across. Alan, it's a concept that is very dear also here to Food for Sustainability is the concept of living labs. We also know that Europe has been pushing a lot for living labs. What is your perspective about their role in achieving the carbon sequestration efficiency needed?
Well, I think the role is hugely important because it's clear that we're not going to reach ambitious targets either in the agricultural sector, reducing agricultural emissions, or in the land use sector without the active engagement of land managers and farmers. And I think it's well known that farmers generally learn best from each other rather than sitting down in a classroom. They learn from each other. They learn from looking at what their neighbors are doing, and I think, you know, living labs in that context are just a fantastic opportunity to try and involve and engage farmers in this effort.
Yes, it's also about sharing knowledge and spreading practices and gaining confidence in making that change. Alan, we have here also a very interesting question that I think relates a lot to the Portuguese reality, which deals with the small strongholdings in Europe. The question is, what type of primary data do you think it will be needed to collect, of course, at an affordable cost, to ensure that these farmers can actually apply and enter the carbon market?
I think that's a really interesting question too, because as I've indicated, I think particularly if we are going to go the certification route, there will be high setup costs. And it's clear that if you're a larger farmer, you can spread those costs over a larger area. And therefore smaller farmers are likely to be less interested and less able to get involved in whatever carbon markets become available. Obviously, one way to try to address that is through some form of cooperative or group schemes, where basically farmers would get together, and the administration would take place not at the level of individual farms so much, although that would still probably be required, but more of it could occur at the level of the co-op or the group, if you like. So that would be one way in which some of that potential discrimination against smaller farms could be overcome.
Yes,
but it's a real issue. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real issue. But for example, what just came to my mind when we talk about bioregions, and some of the regions here in Portugal are trying to achieve this goal of becoming bioregions. You know, one way could be, you know, looking at the farmers as a whole and at a community level, trying to ensure that the region is really carbon sequestering and applying for these carbons as the community. And then those are really very good questions. I will leave this question for the end of the webinar. I think it's also really interesting, the biodiversity credit markets, but we need to move on. I will not forget this question, okay, to ensure, I think maybe we can have a more round discussion. Thank you so much for your questions. But now we need to move on because we also have a very interesting speaker with us, Assunção Cristas. Assunção, while you prepare, I will just briefly introduce Assunção Cristas to you. Assunção has just joined Viera Almeida Partners in 2022 as a partner to head the firm's ESG integrated service platform and the environment practice area, which encompasses ocean and agriculture related matters. She's also an associated professor at Nova School of Law, coordinates the master's degree in law and economics of the sea. Her areas of research are sustainability and legislative architecture and development. Apologies for this. As most of you know, from 2009 to 2020, Assunção held several political positions. She was Minister of Agriculture, the Sea, Environment and Land Use Planning, and also Minister for Agriculture and the Sea. She was member of the Portuguese Parliament between 2009, 2011, 2015, 2020. And during her term of office as minister, she was responsible for institutional reorganization of several areas of administration, participation in the Conference of the Parties, COP to the Convention, negotiation of the European Common Agriculture Policy reform, and the drafting of structural national legislation, such as the Framework Law for Maritime Spatial Planning and Management. Assunção, it is a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you all. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. It's a pleasure to have heard already Alan, who stated very important things that I will pick on. I would say that my presentation is a little bit like a zoom in, looking at the Portuguese. Let me just move. Looking at the Portuguese voluntary carbon markets, the creation, objectives, and key principles. We do have a piece of legislation brand new just from the right beginning of this year, and then we will move a little bit deep on that. But first, just to tell you that, of course, this comes within aligned with the global and European goals. This decree law that was published right in the beginning of January and is in force since the 5th of January, really is rooted back in the Portuguese Climate Framework Law that was approved and published in 2021, just after the European Climate Law. For the Portuguese law, we do have a climate neutrality goal, hopefully for 2045. Actually, it is not mandatory. It is mandatory to move on into studies that might tell us that this is possible, but we are aligned with a 2050 European climate law goal for climate neutrality. Then if we go back, we'll see the European Green Deal, and then we'll see the Paris Agreement with this global consensus that needs, on the one hand, to reduce a lot of emissions, but on the other hand, as the IPCC has been stated, there's a need to remove the emissions that we already have, and we will not meet the goals if we do not interact in the two ways. As for the objectives of the Portuguese legislation, what do we see? We see that we are willing to bring credibility to the voluntary carbon markets. We want to bring robustness and confidence. How? By creating public registration platform, by creating mechanisms to monitor reporting and verification, and of course to bring methodologies that can be applicable and can be verified. We can use this market or this tool both to perform offsettings, but also to make climate contributions. And this is important because there's a lot of criticism about offsetting. And in a previous version of the decree law, it was clearly stated that offsetting was only possible for the residual emissions, but it was too difficult to measure. So in the version that was approved, we don't see that limitation. But of course, it is not going to be easy just to continue business as usual, because it's not possible, as there are a lot of other both national and legal pieces and European pieces of legislation that oblige to different ways of performing the different activities in the various sectors. And I would say that although we don't have that limitation, it's important to keep in mind that this is not to be used just to make life easier for the different areas of activity. And climate action, contributions to climate action, it's an important possibility, and the decree law clearly states that area as an important one. This decree law complements the compliance carbon market, so it's different. It's totally different. It's a voluntary carbon market, which means that we can continue to have carbon trading based on contracts and party autonomy and so on. But of course, and as Alan has already underlined, what we can preview is that possibly, and that's the whole idea of the legislation, once this legislation is fully operational, we will have good, robust carbon credits, and those will be most valuable in the market. So it's a good option to look carefully at this piece of legislation. And what are the key principles? Pretty much aligned with what we see in the European regulation for certification of carbon removals. Credibility, we need to state a realistic baseline to account the greenhouse gas emissions, but both for reduction of gas emissions and carbon sequestration. So we have the two paths differently from the European legislation. Then additionality. Additionality was pretty much discussed, and the version that was approved and was even after the approval and the publication, it was a little bit refined after that. And I will come back to this topic, is not totally aligned with what we see in the European regulation. So it's a little bit more broader, and I will come back to this topic. Permanence, effectiveness, follow-up, of course, transparency and sustainability. So this idea that we are focusing on carbon, but we need to look at the other social economic benefits, namely we should look at biodiversity is also important. Additionality in particular, and why? We used to talk about 3 dimensions to make sure that the project brings additionality. But at the latest version of the decree law, and I ask myself if this is going to continue like this once the European regulation is approved, or if it will be changed again to be aligned with European regulation. But anyway, what we have right now in the Portuguese decree law is 2 requirements, 2 mandatory requirements, and another one that is referred, but actually is optional. The 2 mandatory ones are the climate additionality, which means that the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions or the carbon sequestration associated with the projects must exceed the baseline scenario, and the legal additionality, which means that if the project comes due to other legal impositions, other legal obligations, then it is not additional because it's only complying with the legislation already, what the legislation already imposes. And then the third
seems that we had a problem. We lost connection. Let's just wait a little more to see
is that this
Assunção, sorry to interrupt. Can you hear us? Assunção? Okay, I think we lost her. Okay, so she's back. We still have questions in the chat and very interesting ones.
Sorry.
Hello.
I realized that I was somehow had a problem with the internet. When did you stop hearing me?
Well, you were mentioning
Because
about
I continued and
financial.
continued.
Yeah. You were mentioning financial additionality. That is
Okay.
something that is not compulsory.
Okay,
So we were.
This I cannot see you, but then I heard something that somehow told me that I was not online anymore. So shall I continue?
Yes, please. If you want, just switch off your
Sure.
camera while you're presenting. Maybe you can gain bandwidth.
Yes, I'll do that. Let's just share again. Okay.
They still not coming from these ends, but
Can you see it?
it's yes,
I
it's
was here in
coming.
this.
Yes,
this
we were. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Perfect.
Just very briefly saying that we have the 3 dimensions of additionality at a certain point in the legislation, but finally the version that was approved just put aside the financial additionality as a mandatory requirement, and we only have the climate additionality and the legal additionality. The financial additionality can happen, but it's not mandatory anymore. Let's see if this continues to be like that once we have the European regulation approved. So as for the stakeholders on carbon projects, what do we have? All these people that are mentioned in the decree law. We have the project promoters, we have the independent verifiers, we have the users, of course, the ones that are willing to acquire carbon credits, either because they want to offset their emissions or they want to contribute to climate action. And we have the national authorities that must develop, manage the registration platform, must approve the methodologies, and monitor and develop the market. And among these national authorities, the top one is the Portuguese Environmental Agency. The typologies of the projects, as I've told you, we have the emissions and we have the carbon sequestration projects, and we can actually aggregate the projects if they have the same typology, methodology, and the same period. They can be managed as one single project. The decree law clearly states a priority, and the priority has to do with forestries and because of wildfires in Portugal, also for the recovery of areas that were affected by these wildfires in the last years. This does not mean that will not be workable, namely related to agriculture, but this means that the Portuguese authorities will be focused on developing methodologies for the forestries. It is also mentioned blue carbon, but my guess is that all the others will depend pretty much on the interests of stakeholders and on the proactiveness of these stakeholders. How does this work? Well, we need to have a validation. Well, we need to have a project that is aligned with the methodologies that were approved, still to be approved. We have the validation of the project by the independent verifier, then the registration of the carbon project on the platform, the implementation of the project, including what has to do with risk mitigation measures, the communication of any changes, and whole systems of monitoring, reporting, and verification. 2 sets or different regimes for carbon credits. Carbon credits, simple carbon credits, or carbon credits plus. This carbon credits plus means that they are focused not only in carbon sequestration, for example, but also in biodiversity and natural capital benefits. We'll see and wait for the methodologies that are going to be approved. But of course, the expectation is that the carbon credit plus will be more valuable than a simple carbon credit. And future carbon credits and verified carbon credits. The difference is that the verified carbon credits are issued after an effective reduction or sequestration verified by an independent verifier, and the future carbon credits are estimated and cannot exceed 20% of the total credits in the project. And of course, they need to have ex-post verification. How does this work? So verification, 1 credit is equal to 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. As we're talking about a public registry platform, we will have a serial number. The platform is not a marketplace, but all the trade that is done must be registered in this platform. The carbon belongs, is transferred to another agent, and this needs to be verified within the registry. The carbon credits are valid indefinitely, and they cannot, if they're not cancelled. And either you transmit a credit or you cancel to use, namely for your carbon offsetting. And in that case, it will be cancelled on the public registry platform. What uses are not allowed? They're not allowed for the European trading system. Objectives, not for reducing carbon emissions from the international aviation sector, nor to fulfillment of national determined contributions for any other party to the Paris Agreement. So it's meant to be for other objectives than these ones. How does it work? So we've gone through this. Public registry, registration. Again, this is a voluntary proposal, so there's no problem if people continue to make their trade outside of all this system, but of course, it's expected to be with less value. The issuance of the credits are operated all in the platform. The platform is developed by the Portuguese Environmental Agency, but the entity that is responsible to develop this platform, that is ADEN, which is an energy agency and is an association that brings also private stakeholders. Just to conclude, of course, one of the critical issues has to do with the reversal of carbon, and the scheme is a double one to assure that there is some credibility and there are some means to deal with reversals. And the idea is that the projects must, and the promoters are able to decide if they want to put some carbon credits in the guarantee fund, or if they want to take his own insurance. Both possibilities are in the decree law. And of course, this works for the unintentional reversals. If there is intentional reversals, it's not possible to go into this, but of course, it's a problem of compliance with the contracts. And next steps. For the effective functioning of this regulated voluntary carbon market, there are still some steps that are needed. Some legislation, so complementary legislation on the qualification criteria for independent verifiers, on the minimal conditions and capital of own insurance for unintentional reversals, also on the applicable fees for all these to be working, the VCM platform, the carbon credit transactions, and so on, and the information requirements to be made available on the platform. As for the administrative procedures, pretty much important, a technical monitoring committee is be put in place, so still missing the appointment of the members and also the development of the electronic platform. And of course, before all of this, the approval of the methodologies that can actually come from 2 sides, either from the public side, from the Portuguese Environmental Agency, or from the stakeholder side, the promoter side. There's this possibility of any promoter coming to the Environmental Portuguese Agency and asking to approve a methodology if there is not a methodology already approved for the same type of projects. As for the approval of the methodology, is the EPA, so the Environmental Portuguese Agency, that is competent for the approval, with the support of other public entities, depending on the topic. But also these methodologies are discussed publicly into a public consultation. And before this public consultation, they are analyzed by this technical monitoring committee coordinated by APA. And all of these works, as I would say, the first step to make this feasible and effective. And of course, we need all these different pieces correctively prepared, so the methodologies, but also the platform, and also all these rules to make this workable. So I would say that the decree law is a really good step forward, but we'll still need a lot of work to be done to make sure that everything is working properly, and that will take some time. Let's see how long will it take, but I would say it will be good if we have that in 1 year.
Okay, fantastic. Assunção, we just lost you for a brief second. Thank you so much for this very good overview of where we are. Just one short question. Is the platform for registration already available? Or
it's not. That is one of the things that is in the to-do list. So what is settled by the legislation is that ADEN, so the Energy Agency, will be the one responsible to develop the platform under the guidance of the Portuguese Environmental Agency. But we're still waiting.
Okay, so
and there's a lot of complementary legislation, complementary rules to be approved so that they can do it.
Okay, good. Thanks for clarification. One of the things you mentioned in terms of additionality was the financial additionality. And I think this ties very well with a question that we had from one of the participants, that, for example, baldios, so the communal management of land, were excluded from the eco schemes. So if we take into consideration financial additionality in terms of this carbon markets, definitely baldios that are now probably not being properly managed would fit very well into this financial additionality criteria, right?
Yes, well, from a Portuguese decree law perspective, the fact is that the financial additionality has no longer the strength that had before in the previous project that was under public discussion, because at that time it was a mandatory requirement for the additionality principle to be complied, but right now it's only a nice to have. So this can be something that makes the project more attractive, but it's not sine qua non condition to have the project at stage. So the idea is that, and of course, it will be really important to see what's going to be defined in the methodologies, and that part is really important to if it is possible to issue carbon credits with projects that would happen anyway, either because they have market sustainability or because they're already funded by other schemes. And that is, these details are the really important part, and they are still to be defined in the methodologies. That's why this committee is so important, and also the public discussion that will come after the committee work is really important. So, and this is something that will happen for each different methodology, each different type of methodology in projects.
Yes, that's very interesting, and that's what makes all this case very challenging. Also, from the policy perspective, is if I'm a farmer, if I'm already concerned about the environment, I have some practices like, for example, no tilling and trying to increase the soil organic carbon as much as I can. But I feel that in the future I can do even more. How does this fit into the carbon market? Am I going to be paid by something that, by conviction, I would do it anyway? Where is the line? Am I going to be penalized because I have a ethic concern about the planet, while the others that don't need a financial incentive to become concerned about the planet? So this is a challenging issue.
We need to wait and see, and of course participate actively in the methodologies definition, and also when it comes to agriculture and different possibilities. I would say that it will depend pretty much on the proactiveness of the different stakeholders, because clearly I would say that the Portuguese public administration will not focus on that. They will focus on forestries. That's what is clear in the decree law, and maybe a little bit on blue carbon. But agriculture, I think, will have to struggle by itself and bring the scientific evidence and bring the methodologies and ask for approval. And that is something that people should be aware of. That's a good point in the decree law. So it does not put everything in dependency of the initiative of the public administration. It opens the door for the stakeholders to come to the Portuguese administration and proposing some methodologies. And I would say that the sector should organize itself, maybe different sectors, different methodologies, and bring that very well based, very well rooted in science to make a point. And then participate in the public discussion.
That's a very important clarification.
And that will speed up a lot, I would say.
Okay, that's very important, because there's quite a lot of focus in terms of agriculture, but probably we also need to start, focusing on the short-term gains of increasing soil carbon content, or organic matter, and the effect it has on productivity, and not only to achieve financial incentives from carbon markets that probably, as you were saying, still need a bit of development and to see how they are going to emerge. So we have a question here. We have a participant that wants to know how does the carbon offsetting also covers autonomous regions of Azores and Madeira?
Yes, definitely. It's a national legislation, so it will cover Azores and Madeira as well. Yes.
Okay, thank you. What is the advantage for an investor to trade carbon credits within the Portuguese voluntary carbon market?
Well, that's what we're going to see when it starts working. But the advantage and the goal of this legislation is to bring robustness and credibility to the carbon credits. So make sure that there's a high quality, pretty much aligned with the European legislation on the preparation. And of course, people can continue to trade the carbon credits outside these registries. But one of the critics that justified critics that we hear a lot have to do with the double counting, with the double selling, with ownership issues. And in that case, the public registration will definitely be a point. And in order to enter into the public registration, you need to have a robust carbon credit. So one thing comes with another, and I can tell you what what we're adding at is to have valuable carbon credits. If the market is going to pay for that, if the market is going to recognize that, that is something that we'll only know when it starts working. But the whole idea is that one.
Yes, very, very good. Makes all sense. We have also here a remark. I think it comes up to many of our minds. The question is the legislation reductive in terms of emphasizing only areas that's a traditional burn in Portugal? Why not rewarding areas that are already then being well managed and providing, good examples for the rest of the society?
That's a very good question, and that's something that was pretty much discussed. And again, it depends on how these methodologies are going to consider anything at all that has already been done in the last years, maybe not in the last 20 years, but maybe in the last 5 years or 4 years or 3 years or so, or not. So where will be the baseline year to be considered? And that can make a lot of change when answering this question, because if the methodology will only consider what are the new projects, so projects starting from now, this means that yes, those that manage pretty well their forests will be somehow disappointed, and this might not be that fair. But if the methodology allows some already settled projects that have all the necessary evidence to make sure that they meet the methodology requirements, then in that case,
seems that we lost.
That's we still don't know. That's why these methodologies and this approval system is so important. But I can tell you that it might be unfair, but the fact is the whole scope of the legislation is not to reward what is already there. It's to create incentives for new projects to come in. It's pretty much like when you design public measures to support families and to boost natality. You don't reward the already existent children. You just design the measures for the newcomers, because that's the whole idea. I have 4 children. If any legislation is going to be approved to provide some benefits for large families, that would not apply to me. It will apply for the ones that will be born in the coming years. Why? Because the goal is to promote, in this case, more projects to reduce emissions or sequester carbon. So could be unfair, yes. But that the whole point of the legislation is to make sure that we have more projects helping into these carbon sequestration goals.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll definitely be joining this debate very, very closely. There's still a lot of open questions, but we need to move on. We still have Lynn Bautze with us. Lynn, if you want to start to share your presentation, a couple of words about Lynn. She works at the Research Institute for Organic Farming, FiBL, in Switzerland. Her expertise covers Swiss, European, and international projects around organic farming and climate change. And Lee's main motivation for a practical research is to provide farmers, farm advisors, and policymakers with the relevant information to make a motivated and sustainable shift towards a climate-friendly and, of course, resilient agriculture future. She is the lead author of the book Breathing with a Climate Crisis, has moderated over 20 podcast episodes under Living Farms Biodynamic Perspectives Worldwide, and many-fold farmers workshops and events for climate projects worldwide. Lynn, thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to hear a presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was a little bit worried how to make a good introduction now because I think I come from a very different perspective with a research perspective. But anyway, I would like to share my point of views regarding carbon sequestration. But first, Claudia said I should shortly introduce the FiBL because maybe a lot of you are not aware what the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture is. So we are mainly located in Switzerland, but have already several different offices in Europe. And our work concentrates on Swiss agriculture, but also European projects for now. It was funded in 1973, so it's one of the first research institutes for organic agriculture. And in the soil department, so we have different departments like soil, but crop science, livestock science as well, food system science. But in the soil department, we are mainly focusing on soil fertility and climate change. We also do studies on nutrient management and symbiosis. And we are very practice-based with like how could no-tillage management, for example, work, or how could different recycled fertilizers work. And what I think is particularly interesting when we talk about carbon sequestration is our long-term trials. So we have two main long-term trials. One is the DOC trial. It compares organic, biodynamic, and conventional agriculture with different fertilization rates since 1978, so quite some time, in a system comparison trial. So here you can see how the fields look like. And we are also focusing on the use of different fertilizers, as I said, so compost, slurry applications, biochar we have included now, biogas plants, so different fertilizer products. And for the part of the climate change, we started with just collecting at the beginning what organic agriculture can contribute to climate change. And this is just a small, repetition of what you maybe know. So organic agriculture can help to really reduce the emissions from synthetic fertilizer productions. So if we substitute quite energy-intensive agrochemicals and synthetic fertilizers by organic manure, we can help to reduce the fertilizer methane emissions and N2O emissions. We can also help to reduce emissions from the livestock because organic agriculture prohibits livestock feed imports and is just reducing the livestock feed. And often livestock feed comes with a lot of embedded deforestation, which is currently not accounted in the European Union, but I think it's still important when we look at the system of organic agriculture to also include different system boundaries. So for me, if we deforest a lot of Brazilian forest, this is also kind of European emissions for the agriculture sector. Then we have shown in a meta-analysis from Andreas Gattinger et al. That organic farming leads to roughly about 450 kilogram per year more carbon sequestration per hectare. So this was a meta-analysis that Andreas Gattinger really did among several studies where he compared organic with non-organic farming systems, and he could really show that there are higher carbon storages and also higher net sequestration rates among organic soils. And we can also see that we have lower area N2O emissions in our field trials when we compare organic with non-organic farming systems. And you can also see, I think this is quite important for me when we talk about carbon sequestration, because currently the situation in the European soils is that we constantly lose carbon, but it's just a question of how much we lose. So it's like really, really difficult to actually come to a state where we increase our carbon contents in our soils. It takes quite some time for systems to really build up carbon. And in our long time trials, we could really see that the carbon losses varies among the different systems. So we can see that the highest carbon loss is in the conventional, and then the organic and the biodynamic saves the most of the carbon. But as I said, it's like really challenging because you see the effect after a long time. So when we talk about carbon credits, this is something which we really have to keep in mind, that the carbon is not something which can be built up like very spontaneous and easy. And often, especially the European Union projects, they are looking at 4 years or 7 years. So then they want to see a big change. And this is like really a challenge when we look at the farming realities. And so we calculated in a way, or we try to calculate how much emissions could be saved. And if we would go, for example, for whole European Union organic agriculture, we could save about 17% of EU agriculture emissions, which is still not a lot. I mean, we have to say that even when we convert now totally for 100% organic, we still have to account for the reality that in the agriculture areas, there are emissions which are unavoidable and which are difficult to reduce in the long time compared to other sectors. And as I said, this also refers to the way how we currently account our boundaries and what we see as agriculture and what we include in our calculations for the greenhouse gas inventory and the Paris agreements and the voluntary carbon market. So this, at the moment, everything is a little bit different accounted. And this is maybe a message which is also important working in different European projects, is that it's important to consider what language are we talking. So it's really, really important to differentiate between the different carbon markets we are talking about, because sometimes the methodologies and the ideas are very different. And so this is I think important. And at the FiBL then we started to look how can we really optimize organic farming systems for carbon sequestration and climate change. And we started mainly with 4 topics. So one of them was really to optimize the on-farm nutrient management and to look how can our compost be produced better and how can we utilize biogas slurry better. Then we looked at the optimized crop rotation. So this mainly includes the introduction of leguminous crops, but also like, to optimize the crop rotation in a way that you reduce your emissions. The tillage system. So we had different forms of reduced tillage. So we either increased the frequency of, decreased the frequency of tillage, or the depth of tillage, or we went for a no tillage approach. And also, of course, the implementation of agroforestry system and landscapes elements, which is quite good in terms of carbon sequestration. At the moment, we have various projects with the European Union. So one of them is the Clean Farms, which I would like to highlight shortly because Portugal is also involved in this. And this might be interesting for you. There we are currently exploring how emissions could be reduced on the farm level approach. With life cycle assessments, there we use the Cool Farm tool calculations. But also other tools for doing life cycle assessments. And one particular approach that we are currently exploring is to use satellite images for the carbon sequestration potential. So we're working with AgriCircle and have been taking samples all over the project to really compare how carbon sequestration could be, let's say, more easily monitored for the farmers, because you're probably aware of that the sampling campaigns are quite labor intensive for the carbon credits. And this is, I think, Ellen, you've also mentioned this, that it's really a big problem how to make this in a cost-efficient way, and especially if you're a small-scale farmer, like 4 or 5 hectares, and then you need to do a lot of monitoring for the soil carbon sequestration. This is really difficult. So we are trying to use an approach with the satellite images. The results are not out yet, but I think it's an interesting approach. But at the moment, I would still say it's too labor intensive for the farmer to really practice this. So it's not so easy. Then we also have the Climate Farm Demo project. That's more than 80 partners are involved. It's really a big project among the European Union. More than 1,500 different farmers are involved that demonstrate climate-friendly and resilient agriculture practices. Also, more than 4,500 demo events are to be organized within the next years. Portugal is also involved. They have quite a nice website where you can check in your regions if some events are taking place. So this is something which I can really recommend for the people that are working in practice, so to say. And one interesting thing is that we also collect in this project the various tools that exist for carbon sequestration monitoring and also doing life cycle assessments. And this is just a short list, so I can tell you more than 110 different tools were collected that are currently assessing the carbon sequestration or not assessing the carbon sequestration potential of climate practices. And this is something why I'm personally also from the scientific perspective really critical about the carbon sequestration topic for farms, because at the moment we have so big differences in the monitoring and verification of the carbon sequestration potential. So yeah, I think methodology development is still a lot to be done. So I'm not sure if it can also be really done well. And what we are also doing in this project is to really collect the different measures that exist for the farmers to improve their climate performance. And it includes really like different practices for mitigation, but also for adaptation, or practices where you can combine things. And yeah, and in the soil part, we see that a lot of the data that we have is so indifferent. So like you can have practices where you have a lot of good potentials for carbon sequestration, but then you can also have the same practice, different field, and you will see that the carbon sequestration even is decreasing and changing, and then you go for one tillage and everything will be changed again. So like from the scientific perspective, I think it's really important to have in mind that it's really difficult to deal with this topic. And for the farmers, I think it's very confusing, because you can't really make this like clear suggestions, like for example with agroforestry or planting a tree. It's so easy. You say, okay, you plant a tree and then your carbon balance will be better. But with the soil management practices, it's so complex that it's also difficult to advise the farmers in a proper way to enhance this carbon sequestration. So here I've listed this one paper. I think Claudia will also send you this. I think it gives quite a good overview about what the difficulties are currently from a scientific perspective about the carbon farming. And they highlight like this 5 different points. So as I said, the potential of carbon sequestration is really depending on the soil types and the soil properties. So for example, in Switzerland, we are already quite high saturated in the carbon. And this means that for some of the farmers, it will be really difficult to add additional carbon to the soils. And for other soils, then you still have a potential to build up. So So this is something to keep in mind. And then I think additionality, permanence, and leakage effect we have covered also in the other presentations today. And another thing that I would like to highlight is that it's also really important to look that you don't create new emissions. So for example, what I see sometimes is the reality that in Switzerland, glyphosate is still allowed, and the regenerative agriculture is promoting the no-tillage approach. But then when it comes with a lot of like additional glyphosate spraying and additional emissions created by this, I'm not sure if the carbon sequestration that you might gain from a no-tillage approach is really compensating the glyphosate spraying. And then you also have this adverse effects in biodiversity. So what I would really like to highlight today is that it's good to look at carbon sequestration, and it's good to look at soil, and it's good to look at climate. But at the moment in our agriculture realities, we have so many boundaries that we are crossing that it's really important to not just look on this one aspect and forget the others. And for me, this is why organic agriculture offers a lot of benefits, not just for climate, but also for biodiversity, for water management, and for animal health. And our farmers are showing that it's possible to do organic agriculture, at least from the farms that I know and from the scientific background I have. And so when I look at the overall question of how carbon sequestration can be, let's say, more promoted or integrated into policy debate, these are some of the questions that I still have from the scientific background. So is it really possible to compare the results between the different farms and the different countries in the European Union? And then we really have the difficulty of the system boundaries at the moment. I think at the moment in the European Union, we have a too narrow system boundary of our climate debate. And at the same time, the tools that we have are so different from one another that it's really difficult to compare. And then also at the moment, I see that a lot of the practices are promoted, which are where we have big data gaps. So for example, in Switzerland, biochar is like really promoted heavily among farmers, but we don't know from the scientific perspective yet if it's really a long-term benefit or if we will have other effects on biodiversity, for example, when you spread too much biochar. And so for me, a lot of questions are still open, and I don't know if we have time to discuss this today, but the good things is that I think there are practices available where we can do something for our carbon balance on the farms, but there's still a lot of communications needed to really solve this carbon sequestration issue also on the political debate. So I hope I kept my 15 minutes.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for making across your points in such a clear way. So it was a very interesting perspective also. Most unfortunately, the time really runs very, very fast. We won't have time to discuss all issues, Lynn, certainly not. But one final question for you, and then I'll just go for one final question throughout three speakers. We have a question here in Slido, and the question asks whether you have noticed a difference between carbon sequestration and or carbon storage and the biodiversity in soil biology independent of the agriculture practices. So have you measured throughout while you were testing organic farmers and doing all the comparisons, difference in terms of soil biology and the ability of carbon sequestration and carbon storage, or you haven't measured microbiology?
Yeah, we have quite a good team of microbiologists, and also we cover soil biology, and and I mean you can see difference between the system, and I don't know if this really relates to the carbon sequestration question. So I can't really tell you if more soil biology leads to more carbon sequestration in the different system. But what you see is that there are differences. So I don't know.
Okay, so you are taking into account this measure.
Yes.
You know, soil microbiology is very dear to Food for Sustainability, and this is something that we really strive in terms of even making carbon farming, is that with being able to measure soil microbiology enables to check progress and see where we are and what the benefits are. So we had to leave this also for people to ensure that microbiology is something it is assessed.
It's definitely measured. And it's quite interesting. I think also methodologies will develop further in the next years for really identifying more which soil microbiologies taxas are more relevant or not so relevant for the carbon sequestration. So I think there's also some progress at the moment for the methodology development.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. So one final question, I'll go back to the biodiversity. So we've mentioned about the certification framework. We saw how this can be translated into the Portuguese law, and we've looked into, you know, some of the specific measurements in the programs, for example, in terms of organic farming, in terms of carbon sequestration, and we could tell that this is a highly complex process. My question is, wouldn't it be easier to set up a biodiversity markets, so biodiversity credits instead of the carbon market? Wouldn't it be easier to relate straight away the measures that you are taking at the farm level, using this as a proxy, for example, in terms of the carbon cycle, and have as the outcome the quantity and quality of biodiversity? What do you think?
So this question was not just for me, right?
Yes, it's for everyone.
Okay.
So, but if you want to start,
I can say something if you want. I think, well, the priority, I guess, was for carbon from two reasons. One, because it's the emergency of the carbon, of the climate issues that is at the center of the international and European agenda. We can argue if this is the correct option, but clearly it is the emerging and the very urgency that we can see from all sides that points the carbon and the climate issues as the first ones. We can see that, for example, if we look at European taxonomy, the first delegated act was the Climate Delegated Act, and then after that, and lots of months after that, came the Environmental Delegated Act, where the biodiversity as one of the 6 European environmental goals is there. So I guess it's because of this on the one hand. On the other hand, because it's easier to measure the carbon sequestration, I guess. But you tell me, Lynn and Alan, maybe from a scientific perspective. But what I can read is that it's more difficult to find the indicators for biodiversity. And I guess that is the second reason. And maybe a third reason is because looking at the markets in the world, globally speaking, you see a lot of trading of carbon credits. You have some experiences of biodiversity credits, and I guess that will be the second big market. I'm not sure if it's going to be only biodiversity credits or biodiversity with other perspectives linked to the nature benefits, linked to the ecosystem services, so water, soil restoration, and so on and so on. But clearly, biodiversity is the second hot topic. But climate is in the top of the agenda, at least from the Paris Agreement. But many years before, in the path to the climate agreement.
Okay, thank you. And it's true that we have the soil law and we have the biodiversity framework. They are all set in place to achieve the climate neutrality that is so dear to Europe. Alan, Lynn, do you agree that it's easier to measure carbon sequestration potential rather than biodiversity?
If I could just point participants to a contribution at the recent carbon farming summit, which was organized in Valencia in Spain by another EU project called Credible. And this brought together a number of focus groups, various experts, practitioners, and so on participated in these focus groups. And there was a presentation, in fact, the very first presentation, which you can find on the web stream, which reported precisely on this issue. And it's interesting that apparently the consensus coming from the focus groups was indeed to encourage a move away from a singular focus on carbon to this the idea of supporting a more sort of systems transformation at the level of farming. Now, in practice, what that might mean was perhaps a little bit left unclear. Is it just a question that with carbon farming, you're taking, if you like, individual practices? So, it can be no-till, it can be cover crops, and you sort of pay farmers to do that. Whereas this idea of structural transformation is that you're asking the farm manager really to rethink in a much more holistic way their practice of farming. So it's obviously a much deeper transformation that you want to support. So it's not exactly, Claudia, what you are saying. So it's not sort of paying for biodiversity as an alternative. It's more trying to see carbon farming within a sort of a broader framework. But how to operationalize that, which I think is exactly the point just made, is obviously open to question.
Yeah, when one thing could be that retailers are forced to have kind of a quota of products that adhere to these climate goals in terms of farming, because they are so powerful and they imply directly the management and the activities of farmers that eventually could be one way. Lynn, you were about to say.
I just would like to underline what Ellen just said. I mean, I think it's not just either or. Like, for me, biodiversity is related to carbon sequestration and to climate change. And then I think we should not make the error of like going from this to this and this to this. But instead, right, really looking at a systemic approach. And one project that kind of did this, not in the European Union, but I would like to mention it anyway, because it's our close continent, Africa, is the economy of love credits. They have developed a system from the Sequem farm. It's one of the oldest biodynamic farms worldwide, where they sell credits that really tries to show how farming system can be a complex system of change. And then they work with the voluntary markets and really try at the moment to turn whole Egypt into organic agriculture. So they really go for the big thing, and they use the money from the carbon credits to really support farmers to transfer to organic agriculture in this holistic approach. So I think it's a nice project to look at how they do this on a practical level, because it is quite complex, but still not undoable, so to say.
Yes,
Yeah.
Very good ideas. Thank you so much. The time has really run very, very, very fast. I would like to thank you all for being here. I think for me, it was very rewarding to be here as the moderator with such distinguished speakers. Thank you so much for your perspectives. I know that there was a lot to say, a lot to discuss. Also, a big thank you to all our participants, and I will now call this webinar to the end. To remind you just that we have another session next week. I hope you can join us again to discuss a little bit more about carbon credits, carbon sequestration, carbon mitigation, and how we can all together make a change in this world. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to have you here. Bye.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.